Thing about Martin Luther King that we couldn't find out from anybody but you. And sitting there next to your president, I thought of a story of Martin Luther King and I going to Holland together. He was speaking in Amsterdam at the European Baptist Convention, and he had not been to Amsterdam before, and I had. And so he asked me to go with him. And walking around Amsterdam as two lively young men, he was 35, I was 31 or 2, and I said, Martin, when I was here before with my wife, we walked through a very interesting district. And I said, you really ought to see it. And we went to the corner to cross over to go into the red light district in Amsterdam. And it was in the middle of the afternoon. And he said, no, I can't do that. Everybody knows me. I'm a Baptist preacher, and I shouldn't even be looking. I said, oh, come on, it's a sociological expedition. And as soon as we got to the corner, there was a good old Dutchman said, is that my brother King? He said, see there, I told you we couldn't even sneak and do anything. But then we were picked up by our host, Dr. Hans Hoekendijk, and he and his wife drove us through just so he could see one of the differing cultural perspectives on Holland. Nobody knows that. But I try to do that because my daughter says it's always a mistake when you let people look up to you as though you were some kind of special heroes. And she says, really, you all were just some get-down brothers in the right place at the right time, and you did the right thing. And she said, if you put it that way, then everybody realizes that they can do something equally significant. Now, you're going to have an opportunity soon because on April the 7th, there's going to be an award ceremony here, and Mrs. Rosalynn Carter, the wife of our president, I think the 39th president, I'm not sure. I didn't start thinking about numbers till Barack Obama. But President and Mrs. Carter have formed a partnership. And the idea is to get campuses involved in communities. There is so much energy, so much intelligence, so much vitality. We started this around Atlanta, really, when we were working on the Olympics. And we got college students to go around door to door and find out who was actually immunized and who was not. You know, in a sophisticated city like Atlanta, we found 32,000 children that had never been immunized, that we couldn't have found out without the energy of college students going door to door asking rather personal questions. But then we brought Michael Jackson into town, and anybody that came and brought their children to get immunized got a free ticket to see Michael Jackson. That is a good example. That's one of the best examples of the college and the community working together to deal with a problem that government alone can't deal with, and that families alone and that churches have not been able to deal with. The resources of an institution like this can mean the difference between life and death. And that's true of every campus in America. But especially is it true of the urban universities. We have one very similar in Atlanta, Georgia State University. And I'm very proud of that because I say that when all the banks were collapsing, the only bank that was buying up other banks just happened to have a president from Georgia State University. He got his master's, and it's another little interesting story because Just like Martin Luther King got a C in public speaking, Ken Lewis got a B- on a development paper. And a B- when you're a master's degree student means that you don't get your degree. And so he was almost in tears because he'd done this study of multi-use housing, people of differing income and educational backgrounds living together in housing. And his professor said, you know, this is too idealistic. Well, to make a long story short, when the bank that he was working with merged to form Nations Bank, the NAACP sued them. And they sued them because they said these big banks are going to neglect our communities. So the president knew about Ken's paper, and they decided, Ken said, maybe we could pledge $1 billion to community development along this line. And the guy said, well, we're in the business of making money. If it's worth $1 billion risk, we ought to do at least $10 billion worth. But that worked. And when they began to merge with Bank of America out in California, I knew this was sort of the end of the Southern boys when the sharks from San Francisco got a hold of them. But they had gotten into hedge funds and derivatives, and they were losing money. Nations Bank and Bank of America was building housing all over America, and they were making money. So Ken Lewis ended up as the president of Bank of America on a B- paper. I like to tell that because it means there's hope for all of you C and B- students. And it also says our professors ain't always as smart as they think they are. But I'm a jackleg economist, and I didn't take economics in school, but I've been always at the crime scene. And I've happened to be involved in politics, and because we were building a mass transit system, I was on the mass transit subcommittee. Well, the mass transit subcommittee was under housing and urban development. Housing and urban development is under banking. So because we were building a mass transit system, here I am, a preacher ends up on the banking committee. Well, this was 1973. And in the very first meeting of the banking committee, the three most powerful economists in America, Arthur Burns, who was chairman of the Federal Reserve, George Shultz, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, and Paul Volcker, who was the Assistant Secretary of Monetary Affairs, later became Federal Reserve Chairman, and is generally respected as one of the great economists of our time. They came to tell us that it was time to end the Bretton Woods agreements. Well, I leaned over and I said, what is that? And finally, the congressman next to me said, somewhere back there after the war, they got together and they made some agreements about the dollar. Well, I went home and looked it up. And I realized that in 1944 in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, all of the nations got together and they decided that there would be a stable economic regimen, that the dollar would be tied to gold and every other currency in the world would be tied to the dollar. And so from 1944 almost to 1974, the whole world had a stable, level economic floor on which to develop. Now, I learned later on that that was due to the thinking of a British economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes. And it made sense because it gave the United States and war-torn Europe and Japan some stability, some security, and it really developed the world as we knew it. But then they decided to break it up. And I didn't understand why, and nobody was asking any questions. Well, I was always willing to ask the dumb questions. And I said, well, if we don't have the dollar anchored by gold or something, aren't people going to play politics with the dollar? Well, Arthur Burns took a puff on his pipe and said, young man, you'll soon learn that the dollar does not need you to defend it. I said, well, even though I'm a congressman, I'm a colored boy from Georgia, and he put me in my place. Except that he was wrong, I think. That oil was $3 a barrel in 1973. 6 months later, it was $30 a barrel. 10 months later, it was $50 a barrel. And we've been on a roller coaster going all the way up to $148 a barrel, $143 a barrel last year. And it seemed to me that we went off a stable gold standard where America defined and controlled and set the rules of the game that everybody else agreed to. And we went on an oil standard where nobody controls, where the rules of the game are written every night by bankers transferring money electronically, and that they have created a certain amount of chaos because of their level of greed and ambition. Now, looking back, Paul Volcker wrote a book 25 years later, and he said something very interesting. He said, Dr. Schultz and Dr. Burns and I had not had a chance to discuss this before we went to the committee meeting. We were following the orders of the White House. Well, if the Federal Reserve, the Secretary of the Treasury, and the Assistant Secretary for Monetary Affairs are not giving orders about the economy, who is? And I finally decided that it was a fellow from Chicago by the name of Milton Friedman, who got very angry with Nixon because Nixon broke the rules and put on wage price controls to try to stabilize the economy. And that's to Republicans like Baptists getting drunk in church. And to make up to Milton Friedman for getting off the farm, he then decided, okay, we will break up Bretton Woods and allow the dollar to float. Now that's where the trouble began. It didn't begin with George Bush, it didn't begin with his daddy, it didn't begin with Reagan, but all of them contributed to it. Because it's like creating highways with no speed limits, creating cities with no speed limits and no red lights, and then assuming that everybody is in their own enlightened self-interest going to do what's best. Well, I don't know about you, but I would go to hell in a handbasket because I drive too fast and I'm always catching myself, trying to stop before that light turns red. And if there was a city with no speed limits and no red lights, that city would be absolute chaos. Now that's what we have economically. And that's the world that you and I have been suffering with most recently. And it's a shame to have a disease and not even know what it is. But I have learned that the Lord works in mysterious ways. And that whenever there is a time of trouble, and God needs a man, he raises one. Now, in the 50s, Martin Luther King was finishing his PhD dissertation from Boston University. And he turned down jobs in Atlanta and in New Orleans because he didn't want to get involved in politics. And he picked the sleepy little country town that had never, the headquarters, the home of the Confederacy, the place where the Confederate flag came from. And he picked a little church right in the shadow of the capital of the state of Alabama, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And all he wanted to do was finish his dissertation and learn to be a good preacher and pastor. He didn't have any big ambitions. The height of his ambition would be to have a nice big church like Riverside Church in New York, but only Riverside, not just because it was a big church, but because it was right across the street from Union Theological Seminary. And he really, in his heart of hearts, wanted to be a preacher and a professor of philosophy and theology. The best laid plans of mice and men. It never worked that way. The week after he mailed in his dissertation, Rosa Parks sat down in the bus. Now, he was a new man in town. Nobody really knew him, but there was an old guy by the name of E.D. Nixon who said, now, if we have an election, we're going to have the big Baptist preacher, who was Ralph Abernathy, and the big Methodist preacher, whom I forgot. And they're going to get to arguing, and we're going to lose this movement. And he organized all of the women to decide that Martin Luther King was going to be the leader and the spokesman of the Montgomery Improvement Association. They didn't tell him. He put together the meeting because he was running the office. He mimeographed the handbills inviting people to this meeting at 8 o'clock. And then at 7:30, they elected him the president and the spokesperson. He had no time to prepare a speech, no time to no time to look up a scripture. He had to speak to the people of Montgomery and define a movement that would change the world. And we have copies of that. We have recordings of that because Coretta was expecting her first child, and she couldn't go to the church. So she persuaded the choir director from Alabama State University to lug a great big tape recorder. Now you all got tape recorders in your pockets, but in those days you had to have a big box, about as big as this, with 2 reels on it, and you had to lug it, and he lugged it into the church. Thank God we have a very good quality recording of Martin Luther King's very first major speech. And if he made a C in college in public speaking and a C in seminary for preaching, he knocked the hell out of that speech, and he made an A++ and changed the world. And he did it almost without trying. Something got a hold to him. You know about that. But he couldn't get so caught up in the spirit that he would get people over enthusiastic at what we used to call freedom high. He had to make this a rational, deliberate, systematic, and disciplined, nonviolent movement. Now, that was a large order for a 26-year-old. And yet, in Jeremiah, it says, don't worry about what you'll say when you deliver it up. The Lord who made your mouth will put words in it. And that's sort of what I think had to happen. Now, here we are again. The world is in a mess. And what do we do? Well, God must have a sense of humor. Now, I don't know about you academic folk, and I don't know how you all feel about religion, but The Economist kind of gave Adam Smith a pass when he talked about the invisible hand that guides the economy behind the scenes. Well, stick with me. There had to be an invisible hand guiding the politics of this nation. We are not that wise. We are not that good to find and select and elect a person with the exact cultural DNA that the world needs at this moment. Now, the Lord went down to Kenya, and got an African genius, a man of genius and character, and sent him to Hawaii. And he hooked up with a saintly, innocent little white girl from Kansas, whose parents were saints too. Because the reason they got to Hawaii was that when she was a little girl playing, they had moved from Kansas down to Texas, and she was playing with a little black girl, and other little white girls in the neighborhood started throwing rocks at them. And the daddy decided he did not want his children growing up in an environment, so he packed up and moved from Texas to Hawaii because he didn't want his family growing up in the midst of that Southern racism. So Barack Obama hooks up with this poor little girl, and they have a son. Well, he was a kind of typical African man. He didn't last long. He was caught up by his own ambitions, and he went back to Harvard in 2 years, and they divorced. And she moved on to Indonesia. So you got, and married an Indonesian of Chinese descent, extraction. And Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world. That's the largest Muslim population of any country on the planet. Now, you all might call this foolishness, see, but I think that God's got a sense of humor. And he created him a man with African, European, Chinese, Muslim heritage, where all of his life, anywhere he goes, he's a minority. And he always thought that he was a funny-looking little boy that no girls were interested in, so he just studied. And lo and behold, he comes to Illinois, and people see something in him. Now, I didn't see it, because I was a very good friend of Hillary Clinton. I had known Hillary Clinton since she was a senior in college. When she stood up at her commencement, following Senator Edward Brooke of Massachusetts, who spoke in favor of the war in Vietnam, and Hillary abandoned her speech and made a critique of Brooke's speech. And she ended up on the front page, in Look magazine. And the reason I know about all of that is my mother's godchild from New Orleans was in that class, and they were at the commencement. My mama's godchild is Grant Hill's mother. And I was with Senator Kennedy the other day at the inauguration, and I said, did you all support Barack Obama because your brother sent an airplane and hauled all these Kenyans here? He said, no, we didn't even think of that. But that's too many coincidences for it to be random selection. It seems to me that you all just as well get used to it, that coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. There's had to be a divine hand to create all this mess. Even George Bush is a part of it. Because if the country hadn't been so completely screwed up in every possible direction, we don't give things to black folk until they're all completely messed up. And I look at him, And he's so cool. Now, these Alpha brothers talking about them being ice cool. I don't know what Barack is, but I don't think he even had time for, he was studying while instead of stepping. Thank God. But the brother is cool. The brother does not get excited. He, with the tip of his finger, when Joe Biden was about to get out of, see, white folks can say things and do things that we can't. And Joe Biden was fixing to do something that was not right. Barack just cooled him off. The only person that he gives into is his wife, Michelle. And when she speaks, he turns, yes, whatever you say, dear. My son just got married, and he was having some fuss with his wife and about, coming back to Atlanta, whether they were going to drive or what. And he was all upset. I said, listen, son, listen. Did you not see the leader of the free world? And when it came to family business, his only word was, whatever you say, dear. If you're going to be happily married, learn those words. And it is a man for this season. There is a kind of cultural DNA that binds him to everything from Africa to China, Christianity and Islam. And the reason why it's important for that to be a part of his childhood equation is that it's got to be unconscious. Like the little boy who said, Mama, race. See, that's the way he feels about cultural and ethnic differences. I grew up in New Orleans, and I had an Irish grocery store on one corner, an Italian bar on the other. The German-American Bund was on the third corner. 50 yards from my house, they were Heil Hitler. And they didn't have air conditioning, so the windows were open. So I'm walking by there as a 3-year-old with my father. Daddy, why they got that what is that, the swast? He says, it's a swastika. He said, it's a symbol of white supremacy. And I said, but Daddy, we don't believe that, do we? He said, no, we don't. And he took me to the movie, to a segregated theater, which we didn't do often. And we saw Jesse Owens in the 1936 Olympics win 4 gold medals. And Hitler got disgusted and left. And he said, see, that's the